Okay, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be, and welcome to today's webinar by Illusive Networks, Securing Active Directory, How to Reduce Blind Spots and Paralyze Attackers. My name is Jason Silverman. I'm on the product marketing team at Illusive. I'm not going to be the one who's presenting today, but I will just make a few preliminary announcements before I turn things over to Wade Lance, our field CTO. Today's webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a copy of the recording in your inbox, if not by later today, then by tomorrow. Secondly, these webinars are always better the more engagement we have from the audience, and that includes asking questions. You will be able to ask questions at any point during the webinar in the Q&A tab on the webinar control panel, and we will reserve time at the end of today's webinar to answer as many questions as we can. If we don't get to your question, we will have it recorded and we will try to get back to you if possible via email. Additionally, I know that today is, these times are complex in the world with the coronavirus. We do hope that you and your family are safe. And finally, one more thing I'll say, today's webinar is not going to include a comprehensive overview of the Illusive Networks platform, but rather be focused on the aspects of the platform that are used to secure Active Directory. If at the end of the webinar you want further in-product demo or to learn more about our forensics or about our deceptions, wherever it might be, you can feel free to do so. We'll put a link up at the end of the webinar today. So with all that said, I'm going to turn things over now to Wade Lance, our field CTO. Wade, over to you.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you, everyone, for joining. Looking forward to the time. We're going to try to take about 45 minutes to discuss the material. Try to leave around 15 minutes at the end of the session for your questions and hopefully some answers. Again, my name's Wade Lance. I've been with Illusive Networks for just over 2 years now, but I've been in the advanced threat detection space for about 11 years, and in security and IT operations for just over 20 years now. So today's topic is around Active Directory. We're going to start off with a look at combined concepts, what makes Active Directory vulnerable and what makes it so attractive. We'll spend a little bit of time looking at some of the factors that lead to Active Directory being such a high value asset in the environment. Then we're going to look at some concepts around attack surface management and how attack surface management concepts can be applied to Active Directory specifically. And then towards the end, we're going to look at some attack surface management into practice, both in the enterprise and cloud-based, and so kind of some of the ways that Illusive can provide some solutions in the space. One thing I want to point out is that Active Directory, for the sake of the conversation today, we're assuming that the organization has already done kind of some security best practices around Active Directory. I think I did a Google search earlier in the week on Active Directory securing Active Directory, and there were hundreds of articles out there that look at policy in Active Directory, right? How do we configure it? How do we harden domain controllers? How do we limit access and all that? So there's a lot out there in basic Active Directory configuration and policy enforcement for security best practice, and so we're not going to dive into that today. That's well covered ground. We're going to look at, as we do at Illusive, we're going to look at this situation from the attacker's perspective, right? And kind of how do attackers see it, and some concepts that we can leverage around securing Active Directory beyond just basic security best practices. So with all that being said, let's jump right in. So Look, Active Directory is a super favorite target. 90% of the world's enterprise organizations use AD. I was surprised it was just 90%. It may be slightly higher, but it's certainly, you know, one of the top authentication platforms out there. And no surprise, anybody, successful penetration of AD is you know, you pretty much own the network at that point. Interesting. Microsoft says, you know, 95 million AD accounts either under attack or posted to the dark web as already being compromised. You know, there's a lot of information out there just to demonstrate what a high priority target AD is. So, relative to that, there's been a shift, obviously, in AD in the last few years where O365 and really Azure Active Directory has added this whole new facet to the opportunities around Active Directory, right? Because traditionally there was just Enterprise Active Directory. Now there's Enterprise Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, and obviously O365 highly reliant on Azure AD. And so this in itself just creates its own opportunities around Azure AD. So there's a whole nother, you know, tenant, and there's a whole nother environment to configure. I was blown away, over 10 billion Azure AD authentications annually. And Microsoft estimates that 10 million of those are compromise attempts. So, you know, 10 billion compromise attempts, it's pretty, you know, that's pretty substantive just in Azure AD alone, not counting compromise attempts against Enterprise AD. So again, just this is a high priority environment. So one of the things to remember is that the insider, you know, the attacker that already has a beachhead in the environment, right? We gave it to them. They're an employee, they're a customer, they're a vendor, they're a partner, whatever. You know, we gave them the beachhead, we issued them a laptop or gave them remote access, whatever. Insiders leverage the gaps between Active Directory and Azure Active Directory policy, right? And so, you know, attackers are very adept at leveraging the gray areas between security platforms. And we've seen this over and over again. So Azure Active Directory and O365 have certainly increased the attack surface. And so the general risk, and I say this to people all the time, is to remember that, look, AD is based on LDAP, right? And LDAP is a data delivery platform. Its job is to deliver information to the user. And so a simple DS query from any, you know, enterprise system will provide a bunch of information about the environment. What are the privileged groups? What users are members of those groups? What's the password policy? What are the host names of the domain controllers? On and on and on and on. Remember, LDAP is designed to provide information to anybody that queries it. And we know from experience that one of the first things an attacker is going to do when they establish a beachhead is they're going to begin to query Active Directory to pull down publicly available information now that they're in the enterprise. Administrative accounts are always attacker targets, always, right? Getting access to a privileged account is, the golden rule for attackers. And red team exercises and penetration tests reveal this all the time. Security generally does a pretty good job in most environments. People tend to do a pretty good job keeping attackers out. However, we do know from the data that once an attacker has established a beachhead in the environment, it tends to be fairly easy to move laterally and to escalate privileges and to get access to sensitive credentials. And so this is a high value target to attackers. And again, there's opportunities for leveraging kind of the blind spots between AAD and web-based applications once the on-premise AD has been compromised. And we'll talk a little bit about that, how it speeds access to Azure Active Directory environments. So The defensive AD that we're going to talk about today is going to look at two primary methods. And number one is continuous audit and visibility of how the policies around Active Directory are expressing themselves and what we actually see in the environment itself, right? So policy is one thing. Audit of that policy to see its effectiveness in the environment is something completely different. So this is the first concept in an enhanced level of Active Directory security, is providing a continuous audit of how AD-GPOs and Active Directory is configured in the environment, getting visibility to the actual effect of those policies in the environment, and then a remediation of privileged credentials violations and modification of policies to deal with improvements to policies based on the audit and the visibility that we've gained in the environment. And basically what we're suggesting here, if you think about it, is that as a security organization, we simply step up to the capability that the attacker already has, right? Let's get the same visibility that the attacker does. So let's jump in on attack surface management concepts with an AD bent from living off the land. So in most environments, we don't really have a good perspective as the security team of what the attacker sees. You know, we think as the security teams, we think in terms of Visio diagrams, right? With, you know, here's where you can go and here's where you can't go. Attackers really look at the environment more as a social network, right? What actually is available and where have systems been? You know, if I get a hold of a system and I'm an attacker, I'm going to focus much more on the history that's available on that system, the credentials that are available on that system, more so than what's possible, right? I'm going to look at what's historical because I know those things have already happened, and so I should be good as long as I confine myself to those behaviors. So the real connectivity in the environment is it's constantly changing. The normal business activity creates this kind of history, and it tends to be vast and complex and not really easy to see with a lot of today's security technologies, you know, what actually is in the environment. And so this is what the attacker is going to leverage, right? The fuel for the attack, when we're thinking in terms of a living off the land of attack, is the attacker's potential to exploit the credentials and connection strings that they find on the production systems when they do gain a beachhead on those systems. And then excess credentials that we think we have managed through AD-GPOs and through PAM solutions, you know, we think we have this managed through policy, but in fact, the edge cases and the outliers and the residue of administrative functions, that's what really provides the fuel for attackers. And we see this over and over and over again in you know, red team exercises and penetration tests. And simple tools like Bloodhound can be used to expose kind of the basics of this. At Illusive, we take it a lot further, but that's the general principle. So attack surface management around Active Directory and credentials specifically allows us to block attacker movement and perform basic prevention capability without impeding business agility, right? What we're really doing is ensuring that our desires through AD-GPOs and PAM platforms, that, you know, our intent is actually being enforced throughout the environment. So let's talk about how we do that prevention work using the Illusive platform. So the platform that we have in this space is called, you know, Shock of Shocks, Attack Surface Manager. And the first thing that we have is a rules engine which exposes high risk, you know, conditions. And so the first platform, the first rule set looks at basic user credentials in AD, right? Find stored credentials, how they're being used, how they're being leveraged. And this is not, you know, just what's in AD, it's what's actually on the endpoints itself. Where are credentials being stored in memory? Where are they stored in applications in different areas? You know, what's in the Windows cache, etc. Crown jewel connections, you know, which systems are storing connection strings to crown jewel hosts. That's a critical element. Local administrator accounts. This is a huge vulnerability. It's technically outside of Active Directory, but nonetheless, it is Windows authentication. These are highly privileged users on the local endpoint, and getting visibility to how these Windows credentials can be used is a critical facet. Shadow administrators. This is an area which continues to be a thorn in the side for security organizations, where individual users or groups are highly privileged through ACL or through group nested privileges. Shadow administrators, very difficult to even see, let alone see where those credentials are stored throughout the environment. And then last but not least, Azure privileged identities. How is Azure Active Directory configured and how does it work in the overall environment? What I want to point out in this slide is that of the Illusive attack surface management capability, really only 0.2, the crown jewels platform, is focused on connection strings. All the rest of it looks at credentials in some form or another, right? So this is where we just acknowledge that the attacker's preference for Active Directory-based credentials is extremely high, and so we need to have a lot better capability in this space to be effective. So how bad is the situation actually? So this will be I think revealing for a lot of folks. This is a sample of 10 different environments. There's almost 50,000 hosts in these combined environments, and we went out and did a quick scan of these environments to look at what we actually found in the production environment itself. And let's look at how difficult it is to be effective with Active Directory configuration. This is some pretty straightforward AD policy enforcement issues here. And again, most of these organizations have sound, Active Directory GPOs and policies, but when we start auditing it, we start to find difficulties. So in this first organization, now there are around 2,500 endpoints, just slightly over 2,500 endpoints. We found 30 different instances of a domain admin credential stored in Windows Credential Manager. That's a lot of opportunities to identify and leverage a domain admin that's stored on a local endpoint. In another organization, roughly the same size, actually a little larger, 2,750 plus endpoints, just under 2,800 endpoints. In that same environment, there was only one instance of a domain admin stored in Windows Credential Manager. So through their policy and their training and their platforms, they're doing a much better job in this organization controlling domain admins being stored locally. However, in that exact same organization, we found over 20 different shadow administrators, highly privileged users that are not a member of a privileged group, and those 20 different accounts were being used on 9 different systems, stored on 9 different systems. So already we can see that there's multiple shadow administrators in operation on multiple systems. This again is a huge vulnerability. So in this case, we can see how an organization that's doing a really good job managing domain admin storage on local hosts is really struggling with shadow administrators. We see this kind of thing very consistently. Let's look at larger organizations and a different facet of this. This one organization, about 10,000 systems, we found 84 different instances of domain admin creds stored in a disconnected RDP session that's now stale, right? The user hammered the RDP client, left the session running on the remote host with a domain admin level cred, 84 different instances. That's a huge vulnerability and an opportunity for an attacker. Another organization, dramatically larger, 23,000 systems. This organization had not a single instance of this, right? And that is very effective hygiene and management on their part. Just a super effort. They've totally got this under control. So great job for them. However, they struggle with unmanaged local administrators. In this environment, there are 852 instances of unmanaged local administrators on Windows hosts, and that's on only 743 hosts. So again, we're seeing multiple privileged accounts operating on a single host that are not being managed. This gives you the idea that, look, you can be doing a great job in one area, one facet of AD configuration, policy, and enforcement, but it's the one that you're not able to see and manage is the one that makes it extremely, extremely easy for attackers to move once they get presence inside the environment. So Illusive attack surface management uses a rules engine that allows you to control how credentials are allowed to be stored, what the exceptions are to those rules, and allows you to customize this to your organization through enforcement. Maybe it's okay for an administrator to store a credential on his endpoint or her endpoint. However, why would one administrator's credential be stored on somebody else's endpoint? That doesn't make any sense. So rather than using an anomaly-based system, is this behavior, is this practice anomalous? Illusive uses a rules engine which is much more tightly tuned to security best practice. We can automate a lot of these rules. It's super effective in identifying how is it that the ADGPOs and other Active Directory policies are being enforced in the environment. And of course, we have an enforcement capability, right? It's not just the detection of these conditions and the alerting and visibility into these conditions. It's actually a removal capability as well, right? We're in a position to clean these events, not just tell you, hey, you've got a problem with shadow administrators, but actually go in and remove those credentials from memory when that's appropriate to do, or disable account, or whatever the appropriate actions are for that particular issue. So attack surface management. One of the things that I like about this capability and our customers like is that really what we're doing is we're anticipating lateral movement. The system is constantly asking the question, if an attacker gets presence in my environment, how will they move? What will they leverage? And by anticipating that, we continuously eliminate the conditions that would fuel that kind of movement, right? Simple policies allow us to do that. Gives us global visibility on attack paths into sensitive assets, right? We focus on crown jewels. How would the attacker get to a crown jewel, and then focus on those pathways and clean the connections. I got a quick example of it here. Let's suggest that the crown jewel's over on the left with the red circle around it. This is kind of a high value asset. There are pathways that we've identified from various hosts, right? Movement from this host to that host using separate protocols, maybe RDP here, HTTPS over there, SMB over there, whatever the method may be to move between systems. But once these pathways have been identified, we understand that should an attacker get access to this, non-critical asset, they are in a position to move against a high value asset. And Illusive Attack Surface Manager allows you to identify the choke points and clean those connection paths, fundamentally eliminating an attacker's potential to move against the high value asset. So, it totally changes the game for the attacker. Okay, you may get a beachhead in the environment, but your potential to move against the crown jewels or high value assets is severely hampered, if not in many cases eliminated. So let's talk about how this plays out in cloud-based environments. Azure Active Directory and the cloud structures really add a whole new facet that we need to be aware of. And let's look at some basic attacker methods to exploit the conditions that we find now relative to cloud environments. So one of the first issues that we see very commonly is that attackers will leverage the cached connection data towards crown jewel systems that they find on production assets. So here I've got a workstation system that has two different forms of access into one or several of these cloud assets. Could be just browser-based URLs, right, where the user has not only bookmarked the login page for a sensitive system, but they've also cached credentials, or through platforms like AWS, the CLI, they've stored access tokens. We see this a lot in DevOps environments. The developers are looking for speed of connection into these environments, and so what happens is when an attacker is able to compromise this system, the security team is not aware of the high level of privilege access that is on this system into these cloud environments that an attacker is now able to leverage. They're not moving inside the enterprise, they're moving against cloud assets. We've seen a lot of attacks that have become public using this method. And so one of the great things about ASM is that you've got this the Illusive Attack Surface Manager is this continuous capability to go in and reveal, get visibility to where users have cached credentials to SaaS applications and other web portal-based credentials, and AWS CLI connections, and where these conditions exist, we're in a position to remediate those conditions and say, listen, you know, it's one thing for the developer to store the CLI information, you know, in their you know, command prompts history, perhaps, but to also store the access token on that same host, that's a bridge too far. We've seen that attack play out in the environments, you know, fairly consistently when attackers do get access to these environments. Another problem here is that managing privileges and access to the organization's cloud resources introduces a lot of new complexity, right? We find redundant identities, identities with excessive privileges, vulnerable privileged identities we see in these environments. And so this is an area where Illusive Attack Surface Manager really provides a lot of visibility into where are these privileged identities in the environment to cloud assets. How are they being stored? How are they being used? Who has access to these, and how do we mitigate these kinds of lateral movement options and from the environment? Another capability we want to talk about is the delta that we find between the privileges that a cloud-based user has versus what they have in the local enterprise. So as we go out and examine environments, we see this very consistently, that a user in the enterprise, AD, is not a particularly highly privileged user. They're just a you know, domain user with, you know, the rights we expect a user like that to have. But in the cloud environments that they interact with, they are highly privileged. And this disparity is something that's hard to get visibility into. You know, you can use, you know, CASB solutions to manage various credentials, but nonetheless, that doesn't necessarily tie the cloud privileges to all of the local administrators and all of the local AD users that are leveraging those. So this is an area where we've seen a lot of successful attacks. And again, it's the attacker moving through kind of the gray area between what we can see from an AD perspective, which is versus what's available to the cloud-based user. So one of the things that Attack Surface Manager does is it automatically suggests rules about how domain users and shadow administrators should be examined relative to the credentials that we find on systems that are highly cloud privileged and the overlap between those systems, right? So if a user is a shadow administrator and we're identifying, hey, there's a shadow administrator credential, it's in use on these systems. Oh, and on those systems, there's also credentials that are highly privileged to cloud-based assets. This becomes a very high priority remediation opportunity for the organization because they can see where attackers could easily traverse that space to great effect, and there's a lot of attacks that are publicly available where, you know, that exact kind of work has been done by the attacker. So I'm not going to dig too deep into a bunch of elusive interfaces and kind of walk through this line by line, but I will suggest that this is a view into policy violations in Attack Surface Manager. And you can see that this is, in fact, a domain user credential view about policy violations. In this case, it's saved RDP credentials. But notice over here that there are also Azure-based credentials at play on this system as well. And so now we're seeing the confluence between what's available to the domain user and what's available to the Azure Active Directory user, and these kind of crossovers are areas that require immediate and stiff remediation to reduce the attack surface. So, Attack Surface Manager, Azure Active Directory capabilities. One of the critical capabilities is to automate the discovery of cloud crown jewels to identify what are the applications and systems themselves that people are interacting with in our environment. One of the things we see commonly is that there is some data that can be pulled certainly from proxy systems and from firewall systems to get a sense of what hosts and what cloud platforms users are interacting with in the environment. However, those kind of network-based discovery capabilities don't provide any information typically about what's actually stored on the production system itself, where there's actually credentials stored on the local system relative to those cloud-based assets. And so Illusive Attack Surface Manager not only automates the discovery of the cloud crown jewel hosts and applications, but then it also looks at attacker pathways towards those crown jewels and what credentials are being stored to those assets, right? And so when we link those violations between Azure privileged users and on-prem Active Directory, we're in a position to do continuous audit for those kind of environments, not just for monitoring and visualization, but then also for automated remediation. And sometimes we've seen where, one of the things that we see is that organizations do a lot of work, and this is a classic case where we see this, to configure policy in a way that makes sense to them, and you put your best foot forward. I've been on AD teams and doing configuration work, and you do the best work you can, but really without an effective audit and visualization tool for how those policies and rules are being actually expressed in the environment, you don't see what the attacker sees, right? You don't see those environments. And so really, one of the key elements for Illusive Attack Surface Manager is this ability to see what the attacker would see the effects of the policy, kind of the blind spots, the missing bits, and where attackers are in a position to leverage that so that you can modify the policies and make them more accurate. We had a potential customer where we were doing an initial examination of their environment. We call it a risk assessment. It's a great way to just do a one-time scan of a bunch of systems and produce a report about how that organization is positioned for lateral movement. And it was about 10,000 systems. And one thing we discovered was there were over 1,100 endpoints in that environment that had multiple local administrators that were not being managed by labs. A lot of people are aware labs only allows you to manage just one local administrator account, typically the default administrator. If there are other local administrators on those hosts, they're not being managed, by labs. The users, free to change the password, never, if they want, share passwords between systems. And so we pointed this out to the security team. They were pretty blown away because they felt like, hey, we're using labs, we're managing local administrators. It's like, yeah, not so much on these systems. Then there was kind of the, oh no, how are we, it's going to be a bunch of work to remediate these endpoints, to go endpoint by endpoint, set GPOs to clean these unmanaged local administrator accounts. And we said the good news is Attack Surface Manager can manage that for you, right? We'll just set a policy to clean those credentials, to disable those accounts on the endpoints that aren't being managed by labs. And this will allow for the system to automatically do that remediation for you. I think it took 15 minutes to remediate over 1,100 endpoints in this environment of unmanaged local administrator accounts. And that kind of efficiency, really is a force multiplier for Active Directory teams in their environments. So another option, and this is kind of a more classic elusive use case using our deception capability, but another capability where we can bring to bear in the Active Directory security is to leverage AD objects to create deceptive credentials that we then backplant into the production environment. And really what Illusive is doing here is telling a deceptive story, right? We're leveraging the naming conventions and the group memberships and kind of the way Active Directory is configured, what an attacker expects to see, to, once we've removed unnecessary privileged credentials from the environment, to then back plant deceptive credentials into that environment so that when an attacker does land on a system, they're not able to easily identify what's real, what's not, and we're now putting the burden on them for discovery. And it really gives the security team a big advantage, because when they see one of these deceptive credentials used in a lateral movement attempt, you know that, number one, the attacker has violated security policy to even discover one of these credentials. And then they didn't just discover a credential. I don't know, maybe they used a memory scraper like Windows credential editor or Mimikatz or something to pull a credential off the system. Once they've discovered the credential, they didn't just find it, they actually used it in an attempt to move laterally, right? And so this capability really changes the game, because the elusive deceptive storytelling method is a continuously updated platform that, again, it's not just, deceptive credentials out of a bucket, the same 5 deceptive credentials scattered all over the place. It's deceptive storytelling that is customized to every single endpoint, and it continuously changes based on the way Active Directory is configured and the way that the endpoints use credentials and interact with each other. And so this provides a whole nother layer. Again, we didn't get into it in a bunch of detail today. We certainly can on another session if you let us know you're interested in this capability. But this provides a kind of a 1-2 punch, right? If we've removed privileged credentials from the system that are superfluous and unnecessary, and then we've added deceptive credentials into the environment, it really makes it difficult for an attacker to move without detection, and it dramatically enhances the likelihood that we get an early detection for that attack that has compromised security in the environment. The last thing I'll say on this concept is that the founders at Illusive did not have their history in IT security. The founders of Illusive had extensive background in nation-state red team operations, right? These people made a living on penetrating other countries' networks for their own government. And so one of the things that they understood about our capability, and they felt like was a primary driver, was that we not have an agent on the system. Being an agentless solution in the environment is critical to not being vulnerable to an attacker's methods. And so I think that originally this requirement, this mantra of Illusive to be agentless, was really driven from how do we maintain stealth and lack of vulnerability to the attacker. But what we found is that it's a huge, huge benefit to IT operations teams who do not have yet another agent to manage, right? You're not actually installing or uninstalling anything on the system. It's very unobtrusive and invisible to legitimate users. There's no agent to disable. We find all the time that privileged users, particularly developers, are notorious for disabling agents in order to get more performance out of the machine. It does obviously, not having an agent, it also gives us dramatic scalability, right? We support organizations from 200,000, from 200 to 200,000 to 2 million endpoints. We certainly have customers at all of those scales. Anyway, there's very consistent low endpoint overhead and a very low cost to operate, because we don't have to worry about agent conflict and issues of that nature. So the agentless solution has provided to be not just a fantastic approach for security of the Illusive capability and the security of the endpoint, but also operationally, it's a giant plus. Customers get very excited about that capability. So Illusive heavily integrated into the security stack that organizations have. We got a REST API, all this kind of stuff that you'd expect to see. We continue to add new integrations in our partner ecosystem as we move forward to support everything from endpoint security and endpoint containment and at the point of attack, distribution platforms, cloud platforms, SOAR and SIM, PAM solutions. This has been an essential component for Illusive's explosive growth, is to be a solid member of the overall security team. And that's been a very important aspect for us. So key takeaways for today, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. First and foremost, it's time to take a fresh look at Active Directory, both on-prem and cloud, and look at really auditing how effective the policies and controls that we have in place are, right? What's actually happening on my endpoints relative to how Active Directory is configured. This is, we continue to see people in the news that are successfully breached. There's privilege escalation, there's access to crown jewel systems, and the vulnerability around these credentials and these configurations is a key driver to that. And so it's time to make a fresh look at that beyond just security best practice. And so this is a continuous visibility requirement, right? This is not the kind of thing that you can do once and done. It's not the kind of solution where you come in and you do an assessment once and get visibility on this and you do cleanup, and then you're good, right? This is the kind of security hygiene and practice which has to be done day in and day out, because normal operations just continue to leave residue behind in the environment that attackers can exploit. I was at a customer site a while back, and we did a scan of their environment looking at some systems, and one of the things that we found was a very high number of disconnected RDP sessions associated with 5 specific accounts. And when we were presenting this to the security team, they all bust up laughing when they looked at the credentials that were used for these highly privileged and yet stale disconnected RDP sessions. And I said, okay, what's the joke? I missed it. And they said, that's the incident response team. Those 5 users are our incident investigators, and they're the people that are the prime offenders for disconnected, highly privileged RDP sessions. And I said, okay, look, that makes sense, because if you think about their jobs, when they're doing an incident investigation, they're very, under time constraints. They're connecting to systems, they're pulling data, they're doing forensics and remediation, and then they're reconnecting to systems, they're going back and forth. At the end of that incident investigation, have they really kept track of every single system they've interacted with? And do we now want them going system by system to log back into those systems and then close those sessions? Or would it be a more effective use of their time to just have Illusive Attack Surface Manager automatically go behind them and clean those sessions, right? So again, normal business operations leave this residue out there. And so we need a continuous capability, not just to identify where these conditions exist, but also remediate and clean, right? And so doing, one of the things that we like about this capability, the customers like, is that Illusive Attack Surface Management has a corollary into vulnerability management, right? Vulnerabilities are another way that attackers move laterally. And so most security teams have a solid capability around vulnerability scanning and patch management, shift left in DevOps, right? To DevSecOps, make more secure applications. But, people talk about vulnerability scanning, the vulnerability scanners don't do patching, right? They don't automatically remediate those solutions. And so that's something that people really like about the Illusive Attack Surface Manager, is we're not just creating visibility to these lateral movement opportunities, we're actually remediating and cleaning those conditions as well. So it's very much a force multiplier for the security teams. And then last but not least, certainly, is the potential to leverage the attacker preference for privileged credentials into crafting authentic deceptions, so that when the attacker does land, we know what they're going to do. We're giving them the fuel that they're looking for, but rather than it being legitimate credentials, it's deceptive information. So that's the story for today. I appreciate your patience as we walked through that material. There is more information available, obviously, on our website. from the different links up on the site. I won't bore you with reading all of that today, but that's available. Certainly follow up with us if we can provide more information. So Jason, my expectation is we probably have some questions out there. I'd be happy to entertain questions in the time we have remaining.
Great. Yes, indeed, we do have some questions. Just a reminder to people that there is still time to ask questions now if you would like in the Q&A tab on the webinar control panel. And we'll try to get to as many as we can. I'll read out a few as quickly as possible. The first one is, what about using an alternative Active Directory structure like a domain prefix for deceptive accounts? The idea being to have a way to lure attackers away from the real AD data.
So this is a classic deceptive method, and yet one of the idea of alternate domaining, whether you use a domain prefix or whether you use an alternate domain that you then create a trust. The Illusive founders avoided that method completely, and for a couple of reasons. Number one, alternative AD, upon any investigation by an attacker with any sophistication, that story breaks down very quickly, right? Because when I begin to look at, when I get access to a system, I begin to look at the currently logged on users and the credentials that are available and the host that I'm accessing, it's pretty easy to determine that that's not the real AD. And so we find that attackers of any sophistication level are very quick to avoid those kinds of approaches with alternative AD. You really do pretty much have to focus on production AD, in our experience, to be effective. The second thing I will say is that operationally, alternative AD creates a whole bunch of pain for the Active Directory team, and we've certainly seen situations where people have taken that approach. Again, I've been in this space for a long time, and at prior companies, we used that method. And we created IT pain for Active Directory teams exactly in that space, trying to administer AD. Now there's an alternative AD, and so people want to get in there and manage it. What do you do about the licensing for that alternative Active Directory, right? As far as licensing the servers, licensing the accounts that are on it. And so we've completely avoided that method because it really doesn't hold up to scrutiny by an attacker with any level of sophistication, and it tends to create way too much IT overhead. But that's a great question.
Okay, great. Another question. Some approaches use an agent to send attackers misinformation when they attempt to pull information from AD with processes like dsquery. Does Illusive use this method?
Great question. So again, this is kind of one of the classic, long time ago, when it became so apparent that LDAP was such an accommodating protocol to provide information to attackers, and that we knew, the security, organizations generally, kind of understood that attackers query Active Directory, dsquery, and 35 other ways to get access to that information. So one of the kind of legacy approaches that has been tried is to run an agent on the endpoint so that when a user attempts to query Active Directory, we would capture those queries and then provide the user false data. Now, there's a number of problems with this. First of all, it's an IT operational nightmare in that any platform that runs on that system is going to get false data when they attempt to query Active Directory, right? It's not just malicious users that query Active Directory. Lots of things query Active Directory, and so attempting to keep those lines clean and neat is a real problem. The other thing is that it's very straightforward to disable that functionality. Simply identify the agent and kill it, right? And as soon as I identify the agent, we're back to this issue of trying to use an agent in a deception play. I've never seen an effective deception methodology that included an agent. It's just too easy to discover it and kill it. Even the rootkit-based solutions are just too easy to identify and avoid or provide false information to. One of the classics, this is about 10 years ago at a prior company I was at, we examined this method, and an administrator trying to do his job when he would land on systems for basic administrative functions, the first thing he would do was kill that agent that was designed to provide misinformation to AD queries. Then he would go about his work, and he had gotten out of the habit of re-enabling the agent. So we discovered after a month or so, dozens and dozens and dozens of systems where the agent had been disabled, and we thought, oh no, there's an attacker operating in this environment. He's identified the agent, he's killing it. It's like, no, that's just one of our IT admins who's trying to get his work done, and he's not all that worried about cleaning up behind himself. And so this is a method, again, any agent-based solution to deception. Look, if you're running EDR and AV and DLP and those kind of solutions, agents make a ton of sense, right? But when you're using a deceptive methodology, in my experience, agents are endpoint overhead and a vulnerability to the attacker and an IT pain that you just don't need. Great question.
Okay, someone asked if, in lieu of an agent, because Illusive has no agent, how does Illusive collect information from the network?
Great question. So our basic architecture is, we tried, initially we looked at what could be gathered from the network, doing network monitoring and scanning, and you just cannot see from the network perspective what's actually stored on the endpoint, right? How from the network perspective are you going to tell me what's in the browser history? You can't. You can tell me where the browser went, but you can't tell me what of that information was stored in the browser history, right? What's bookmarked? You won't know. What credentials are stored in the browser? Can you see that from the network? Yeah, absolutely can't, right? So we had to walk a fine line at Illusive between having a persistent agent and having the deficiencies of the network-based visibility. And so what we came to was a very unique approach called a dissolvable binary. So we have an executable that we send to the endpoints where we execute that process on the endpoint. It gathers information from the endpoint, what credential and connection information is available on this endpoint, what would an attacker see if they got a hold of this endpoint. That executable then sends that data back up to the Illusive management server, which can be cloud-based or on-prem or virtual or wherever you want it to be. Then that process enforces policy and cleans any of that information off the endpoint that is superfluous, and this really reduces the attack surface, and then that executable backplants deceptive history on that endpoint, or modifies the deceptive history based on changes on how that endpoint's being used. So at the end of that process, that executable deletes the backing file and also kills its own process. So there's no residual left on the endpoint besides the deceptive data, right? There's no process running in memory. There's no executable living on the hard drive. There's no registry entries telling you where the application is. There's nothing for an attacker to detect or disable, but the deceptive data is left behind on the endpoint. Now, we do detection from the network side, and we can talk about that in another call about how we do detection when an attacker attempts to move laterally. And when we see those lateral movement attempts from the network perspective, then we use that oh-so-elusive method, which is to send a dissolvable binary straight to the source of the attack, straight to the production system, in order to gather forensics information and contextual information from the source of the attack, right, the production system where the attacker is operating. So again, we've got source-based forensics data from where the attack is coming from inside our network without having an agent. So you have exactly the same problem if you run an agent with your ability to collect source-based forensics data. If I'm a sophisticated attacker, I simply disable your agent, or worse, use your agent to identify all the deceptions on this endpoint and then delete both the agent and the deceptions. And then that just deleted your forensics capability as well, and now I'm free to act, and you're not going to see, you're not going to be aware. It's a huge vulnerability. So this is a completely unique approach. We think it's a very unique approach for sure in the security space. This dissolvable binary approach, both to endpoint introspection and deception planting, and then also for forensics collection. But we found that it perfectly walks the tight line between getting direct endpoint visibility, and not that typically you need an agent for, and not having the vulnerabilities that agents or the IT overhead that agents introduce into the environment. So it's certainly a change in behavior for security and IT operational teams to use the Illusive method, but it is super popular once they've experienced it. It's a great approach. Yeah, great question.
Okay, we had a question also. I think it's maybe asking us to expand a little bit, but how can we use deception to detect an attack against AD?
So great question. So that really goes to the idea of it depends on the kind of attack against AD that we're referring to, right? Are we talking about a host in the enterprise that is querying AD for information? Are we talking about privileged execution on an endpoint where then I'm attempting to get a session in the environment? Or are we talking about where an attacker escalates or promotes a production system? We've seen this more than a couple of times, where an attacker will leverage a non-Active Directory domain controller, and they will promote that system. Once they get privileges, they'll promote that system to being a domain controller, and then once they've synchronized it with the domain, then pull the database offsite for decryption and analysis. And so, with all of those methods, we use a combination of deceptive privilege credentials and crown jewel based monitoring to monitor both for all the domain controllers in the environment, who's able to use which protocols to communicate with domain controllers. So for instance, it's one thing for someone to interact with a domain controller, which we would consider to be a crown jewel, using HTTPS or SMB. It's something completely different for someone to interact with that domain controller using RDP. So with Illusive, we would be managing those different protocols and determining who has access. I guess managing isn't the right word. We'd be monitoring for different kinds of interactions with those systems and which systems are allowed to do that in order to deny an attacker easy movement against a domain controller and Active Directory, but then also detect when an attacker is attempting to do that, because an attacker, again, is going to run into deceptive credentials and what appear to be additional deceptive crown jewels in the environment.
Okay, why don't we take one more, because we're getting close to the end of the hour of the webinar. Someone asked, I have a PAM solution to further protect privileged users. Are there still security gaps around AD if we have a robust PAM capability?
Yeah. This is a great topic. So I'm glad we brought this up. So the answer is absolutely. We've got a heavy integration with several PAM solutions, more coming all the time. So one of the things that we find is that, look, PAM solutions only work on the credentials that they're managing. And there are always credentials that PAM solutions aren't managing, right? And so one of the great things about Illusive is we really provide value across a couple of fronts. Number one, we can discover credentials in the environment that are privileged and not being managed by your PAM solution. And we'll provide very quick visibility to that. Hey, this credential is highly privileged. It's not being managed by PAM. Oh, and by the way, it's being stored on these 3 systems, right? So that level of visibility allows the identity and access management team or the privilege account management team, the AD team, to get a lot tighter about how credentials are being managed, which credentials are being managed, and where those credentials are allowed to be stored. We also look at when we find privileged credentials out in the environment. There are many, many cases where you don't want a credential to be managed by a PAM solution. Service accounts are a classic example. And so now we've got these highly privileged service accounts, and we need to set policy around where those are used, how they're able to be used, and monitor for policy violations to make sure that the desire of the AD and the PAM team is actually being expressed in the environment. And so this is one of the things that Illusive Attack Surface Manager can really provide a lot of value around, is making sure that the combination of AD and PAM and IAM solutions are in fact giving you the bang for the buck that you planned on with our audit and visibility capability. Yeah, great question.
Okay. I do see that there were a few other questions. We have those recorded and we'll try to respond by email when possible. We are running out of time for now. Just a couple of things, a little bit repeating from before the webinar, but today's webinar has been recorded and we will send you a copy of the recording. If you want to get a more comprehensive demo of the Illusive platform, including a deeper dive into deceptions or the comprehensive source forensics that we provide, you can do so at illusivenetworks.com/demo. You can see the other links on the screen as well. And we hope that you found this webinar valuable and informative. Thank you very much to our presenter, Wade Lance, and best wishes for everyone to stay healthy. And we'll see you again soon. Bye, everyone.